Welcome everyone to this afternoon's online town hall on Victoria's donation laws. We might just give everyone a few minutes to join and to let everyone into the call. While we do that, I'll let you know that we have Alice, Iona, and Kayla online today to assist with any technical difficulties you may have. Feel free to reach out to them in the chat if you need any assistance. Thanks everyone for joining us today. A really important conversation about Victoria's electoral finance laws and what the current situation means for democratic integrity more broadly. For those who don't know me, I'm Tom Mooney, the Campaign Director of Democracy Council at McKinnon. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge today I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, as I do also to the elders of lands from where you're joining today's town hall. Please feel free to introduce yourself and share the country you're joining from today in the chat. I'll tell you more about the Democracy Counts campaign a little bit later. And I might just leave it for another minute or so to make sure that we can let others join. I might, given it's 4:02, start off. Um, as I'm sure you're all aware, last month the High Court decision struck down Victoria's electoral funding laws. That was a matter brought to the High Court by two former independent candidates. The legal challenge was centred on not giving some parties or candidates an advantage in electoral funding over others. And while it's a welcome opportunity to rethink a flawed system, an unintended consequence of the legal challenge was that the entire section of the Electoral Act that deals with funding has been invalidated. What that means is that 7 months out from a state election, there are now no donation caps, no legal requirement for parties or candidates to disclose who is funding their campaigns, and there's no system for public campaign funding. I know we can all agree that Victorians deserve a fair and transparent electoral funding system. So the question is, what happens next? What does a fair, transparent electoral donation system for Victoria look like? What are the immediate priorities that the Parliament needs to implement now? And what reforms need to be given considered robust thought? Before we get into things, just a bit of housekeeping. First, for these online town halls, we really love to see everyone's faces. It helps us feel a sense of community and atmosphere. So if you feel comfortable with it, please leave your camera on. Today's event is being recorded so we can share it with those who couldn't attend this afternoon. So just note that it will also be available on recorded and available online. The format for the town hall will be pretty relaxed and interactive. You'll hear from our guests, of course, but we are really keen to hear from all of you who are joining us this afternoon. Today we'll be using an interactive tool for feedback and discussion. You should see a QR code on the screen now. If you scan that using the camera on your phone, it will take you to an interactive tool where you'll be able to actively participate in today's town hall. There's also a link to that website in the chat here on Zoom. So if you don't have your mobile handy, you can click the link on your computer. Once you've got the tool, please click on the heart emoji on the screen to let us know you're in there. You can use the chat here on Zoom for your comments, and we welcome your questions for us and for our panelists there too. I know I don't need to say this to such a wonderful group, but please make sure all comments and questions are respectful. We greatly appreciate your views today, so please jump on and answer the questions when they appear. I think that's all for housekeeping. I'd now like to welcome our first panel. We're thrilled to have Justice Robert Redlich, Director of the Accountability Roundtable and former Supreme Court Judge, who from 2018 to 2022 led Victoria's independent broad-based anti-corruption commission. Joining us also is Dr. Catherine Williams, Executive Director of the Centre for Public Integrity and an expert in democratic accountability and public policy reform, with research spanning political finance, executive accountability and lobbying regulation. Zoe Daniel, the former member for Goldstein and former foreign correspondent, is currently involved in a challenge to the federal donation regime. and Zim Nakora, an associate professor in politics and policy studies at Deakin University, where he currently serves as associate head of school, international and engagement, in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Zim's research focuses on the politics of constitutions, political party systems, and political finance. Before I go to the panel, if you take a moment to look at your device, you'll see we have a question for you. What was your reaction to the news Victoria no longer had any political donation laws in place? And as you listen into the panel discussion, I encourage you to put any questions for our panelists in the chat on Zoom. While we wait for your questions to come through, Catherine, I might start with you. Can you give us a bit of background on what Victoria's campaign finance laws looked like before the High Court decision, how they came to be, and what kind of weaknesses advocates like yourself saw as having room for improvement?
It's a great question. Thanks so much, Tom. And these were reforms that were introduced in Victoria in 2018. They did, like, unfortunately, reforms in other jurisdictions in this space around the country, lack what we see as a really robust process around them. So we didn't see a process where there was independent expert advice given in respect of appropriate settings for reform, a really robust public consultation process, meaningful parliamentary scrutiny, all those things that are hallmarks of really, really good legislative process, unfortunately weren't in place here, except for one important thing that I'll talk about a little bit later. What the laws did do when they were introduced was significant. So they introduced what were actually quite good transparency provisions. They introduced in Victorian law a requirement to disclose what constituted political donations within 21 days of receipt of those donations, and then the VEC disclosed them to the public within another 7 days. As of course, when we talk about real-time disclosure, that means different things in different places around the country, but in Victoria since 2018, it has meant that we will find out 28 days after a donation has been made that it was made, how much it was, and to whom it was made. So they were important transparency provisions. We also saw implemented a ban on foreign donations. We saw significant reform to public funding. So what we saw introduced into Victorian law were 3 kinds of public funding. We have now administrative funding. We have also dollar per vote reimbursement funding, which is what exists in many other places around the country as well. And we have policy development funding, which is an important kind of public funding. We see that in place in best practice regimes around the country. But the public funding arrangements in Victoria are problematic for a series of reasons. The other key feature of the reforms as introduced in Victoria was a cap on political donations, and it was a strict cap of what amounts now, it's indexed annually, and it now amounts to almost $5,000 over an electoral cycle. Now, it was clear when those laws were introduced that there were significant issues with them. Some small issues in respect of quality of disclosure requirements, because while, as I said, in Victoria, we find out 28 days after a donation has been made that it was made, in other places, there are things that are properly approximating real time. And we see in the optimal regimes a reduction in disclosure period as we get closer to an election, sometimes going down to a week or 24 hours in an election period. So Victoria could probably do better in respect of real-time disclosure of donations. But there were some really significant problems in the legislation as well. One of those was the definition of gift. And here, it's an area of law where really the devil very much does lie in the detail. 2 key problems as we saw it, at least 2 key problems. One was the fact that affiliation fees were excluded entirely from the definition of gift. And there may be an argument to be made around affiliation fees needing to be treated differently from other kinds of payments. But in Victoria, they were completely excluded. That's different from, say, what happens in New South Wales, where they do constitute gifts, though they're exempt up until a particular amount. So this is an area that we knew needed work in Victoria. The other key issue that has been a problem since inception is the nominated entity exception. And what that did was create a system whereby the legacy parties, so the Liberal Party and the Labor Party and the National Party, were able to benefit significantly from nominating one entity from whom transfers did not constitute donations. And that meant that they were not subject to any cap. So while other people trying to raise money did have to deal with these very strict caps, instead, the legacy parties that had these assets that they could put into vehicles to produce income for them on an ongoing basis had an unlimited source of funds that they could tap. And because in Victoria we didn't have an electoral expenditure cap in place, it really did create a diabolically difficult situation for contenders other than major parties to be able to compete in our elections. And we certainly saw that happen in the last Victorian election. Now, to just round it out, I did say that there was one good thing about the process that happened in Victoria in 2018. And what that was the inclusion of a robust statutory review process. And that was as a consequence of negotiations in the upper house to pass the legislation. There was a very strong clause written into the Electoral Act that said that there needed to be an independent panel process run after the first election to consider certain minimum issues, as well as other things the panel wanted to consider about the regulation of political finance in Victoria. And what we got was a really rigorous and comprehensive report from that expert panel that recommended a series of changes to Victorian political finance laws, including the abolition of the nominated entity exemption. Unfortunately, the recommendations of that panel have still not been responded to by government. So, as I say, that was a really important inclusion in the legislation. It allowed for transparency of the consequences of the reforms, and from that transparency can flow political accountability. And now we're dealing with the fact that some of those things that needed to be addressed were not. Thank you, Tom.
Uh, Thanks, Catherine. And just on quickly on to expand, Catherine, on the impact of the High Court decision. I guess just explaining, if you don't mind, the role of the court in making that decision and how that action came to be.
So what happened in Victoria was that following the independent expert panel report, there were multiple requests made of government to address this problem in respect of dominated entities, a problem which I would also note the Centre for Public Integrity has been calling for reform of since 2022. So this is an issue that certainly has been on the radar for a long time. And then the panel, again in 2024, emphasised the need to change the structure of these arrangements. That change was not forthcoming, and there was not reform either following requests to the government that it address it. As a consequence, the provision was challenged by two Victorian, one representative of a minor party and one independent. And what ultimately happened in the High Court that resulted in the entire invalidation of Part 12 of our Electoral Act was that Victoria had to concede that there was no constitutional justification for the differential treatment of nominated entities. It's quite a technical point. It was really the fatal flaw was that in the Victorian legislation, there was an arbitrary deadline in the legislation that meant people who could establish an entity before a particular point of time got a much greater benefit than anybody afterwards. And also, independents could never have a nominated entities, while minor parties could have, independents never could have. And it was really the fact that Victoria had to concede there was no constitutional justification for this differential treatment that resulted in the invalidation of that provision.
Thanks, Catherine, for expanding on that. And Justice Redlich, I'll go to you now. As IBAC Commissioner, you led some really important investigations into political integrity in Victoria, including into the misuse of public resources and publicly funded staff for political purposes. These issues, just like the issue of political donations, have really important implications for public trust in politicians and politics more generally. Do you think we're seeing a decline in public trust? And if so, what do you think can be done to earn that trust back?
Well, Tom, you're catching me by surprise. I hadn't anticipated such a difficult question to answer. I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the public domain now about the level of integrity in the way in which executive government makes its decisions. Um, not all of it, not all of it is valid, but I think it's fair to say that there is an increasing concern that government is not giving sufficient attention to making decisions which are transparent and leaving it in a position where it can be accountable, where integrity is missing from the decision-making process. That is a concern, and of course that feeds into the issues that we are going to discuss this afternoon. If those who stand for Parliament are limited in their capacity to obtain campaign funding, then that potentially has consequences in terms of the ultimate makeup of Parliament, remembering that Parliament has the ultimate responsibility under the Westminster Conventions for holding the government of the day to account. And so if the constitution of Parliament is affected by a campaign and elections, then it makes it more difficult for Parliament to hold executive government to account.
Yeah, thank you, Justice Redlich. What's happening in Victoria obviously has implications at a federal level too, given the High Court is also considering the matter brought by Zoe Daniel and former South Australian Senator Rex Patrick. So, Zoe, on that High Court challenge to the current electoral finance laws of the federal system, you've likened that system to a cosy table for two, in that it favours major parties. Can you tell us about the challenges independence candidates face, both in your own experience and that of those who might be thinking about having a run at politics in 2028?
There are just immense differences and intrinsic disadvantages to running as an independent. You come in from a standing start. You have to build reputational credibility and profile against monolithic major parties that have huge brands and an enormous amount of embedded awareness within the electorate. So that requires money. It's unfortunate. And you're also up against major parties that have big war chests that they've built over generations. I would love to think that we could get big money out of politics, but the issue that I'm fighting is the tilting of the playing field towards those who already have entrenched power and against individuals who are trying to directly represent communities. We know that there's a demand from this. We can see it in the way that people are voting, that they're looking for alternatives. And I think that in the Victorian case, arguably, you could say that when the legislation was written, the drafters weren't necessarily thinking about independence because there weren't as many independents in the frame. But I don't think, and that's being kind if I was to be generous, but in the federal case, I don't think that's arguable because we were well and truly in the frame and trying to have these conversations with the federal government while they were drafting around the fact that the independents, myself included, really believe in increased transparency, in real-time disclosure, and in some form of capping both donations and spending, but only if it's fair. And the government refused to listen. In the Victorian case, as Catherine's pointed out, the government was told that there were issues with the legislation and had the opportunity to change it. And in both cases, there wasn't enough listening, and the major parties got together to put together a system that disadvantaged others who were trying to compete with them to create the kind of accountable democracy that I think that we all want. So now we have one case decided and a bit of a mess in Victoria with no legislation in place and another case on foot.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe, for sharing your experience and just a comparison between what we're seeing in Victoria and what's happening at the federal level. Going to you, Zim. Now, I'm just continuing to zoom out, and we've started with Victoria. We've looked at the federal system and Zoe's experience, and your research has compared how systems in countries including Australia, the UK, the US, and Nigeria can ensure or undermine, on the other hand, political integrity. What can we learn from international examples, both in terms of what to do, but also what not to do?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for this opportunity. This is a great debate. Um, we can learn a lot from international experience. I think political finance is a very thorny area. Zoe put it well whenever she explained that the conundrum is the fact that we need money in politics, but basically nobody wants to pay for it. And there's no perfect way of doing this, right? And there are many different models that we observe in practice. They vary in terms of a variety of dimensions, many of which Catherine mentioned with respect to Victoria. But some of the other dimensions that I want to stress include the funding source. So this includes, for example, whether we're talking about public funding, and that can be structured and calibrated in a variety of ways. Private funding, something similar can be said. This can be structured and calibrated in a number of ways. Many systems have a mixture of public and private. We might call these dual source arrangements. There are systems that rely on vouchers, which are rather different from public and private funding in the sense that they have a public component. The voucher is typically public money, but citizens get to disperse it. So they engage in activity that we typically associate with private choice. And then there's other schemes. So one that's been discussed in the literature and one that I find quite intriguing is what might be called the anonymous donation scheme, whereby people can donate to parties via an independent body like an electoral commission. And they must do so anonymously. And this can be capped and so on. But the key thing that this system would do is to reduce the capacity of donors to ask donees for favors. So the idea is it would reduce this kind of strings attached mechanism that can be problematic for accountability. Each of these designs and the other ones that we might also consider in this story have pros and cons. And a lot of the debate in Australia has been very focused on this notion of undue influence, which is a concept of fairness. It's tied up in the history of law in this area. But there are also a number of other very relevant concepts that we might want to think about in a broader debate around democracy and political finance. And they include notions such as transparency, corruption, participation, policy distortion, the impact of marginal voices. And all of these desiderata can be affected and influenced by political donations. And therefore, if we want to have a conversation about how to revise and reform the political financing system, I think we need to consider the values that we hold dear, that we want to prioritize, that we want to focus on. We also need to consider at an intermediate level the nature of political competition, because one of the things that we see from research is that political finance laws, their impact is conditioned upon the characteristics of political competition. Whether you have a two-party system, whether you have a system of moderate pluralism with 4 or 5 parties, whether you have a bunch of independents in your party system, all of this has implications for the translation between a set of laws and the impact on the sorts of fundamental outcomes that we're worried about, whether that be democratic accountability or participation and so on. So all of this is to say it's a complicated equation. And I think at this moment, what I would implore colleagues and the audience and sort of people who are stakeholders at this juncture is to find ways to create time for us to consider the options. Because I do think it's a complicated moment. And what we don't want is a rushed decision that just fixes things for those who happen to hold the keys to power at the moment. We actually want the right people in the room bringing the right considerations to the debate.
Zim. I think the need for time and a proper process around any of these reforms, which are complex, is a central component of what we called for, along with partners, as a part of an open letter published in the Age last week. So a point very well made, I think. As you've been speaking, we've asked our attendees for their reactions to the news that Victoria no longer had any political donation laws in place. The kind shocked, a lot of shock and concern, but encouraged the undemocratic nature of the donation laws are being addressed. Someone else has commented that it exposes the ongoing challenges so that the public is more aware. Some excitement that unfair skew laws would be removed, and relief for the win, but disbelief that given the writing was on the wall early in the piece. And I think Catherine made the point earlier that she and other experts had been expressing concerns about the design of those laws for some years. Someone else has commented, bad for democracy, need more transparency around political donations. And certainly I think the point that has been made today is that the concerns about those laws and their design have been expressed for some time. And what we and organisations like the Centre for Public Integrity and Accountability Roundtable have called for is immediate action to ensure that there is transparency and a return to those compulsory disclosure requirements as a matter of urgency. Let's go to our next question for the audience. That question is, what one word describes what you want to see in new donation legislation? We'll come back to your responses in a moment or two. Let's now go to some audience questions. See if we've got any in the chat. One question is, what does a genuinely fair donation regime look like? And how far is Australia at both the state and federal level? How far away, is Australia at both the state and federal level from actually getting there? Catherine, I might throw that question to you in the first instance.
That's a great, really meaty question. Okay, so the features of a fair regime, I think there's two important considerations. There's the substance considerations and there's also the process considerations. And the process considerations really shouldn't be undervalued, because when parliaments are legislating in this area, they're obviously legislating in an area that affects their own interests. So there's an inherent conflict of interest in place. And that's why we really need to see robust processes in place in respect of legislative processes relating to electoral finance. And so when I'm talking about robust processes, I'm talking about independent policy advice, meaningful public consultation, transparent exposure draft with a consultation process attached, meaningful parliamentary scrutiny as well, at least via a committee process, and then accountability in the form of an appropriately robust statutory review. So there's a process side here, and the only place other than Victoria that has a really good process in place is South Australia. So obviously South Australia did really significant reform work here in 2024, and the government at that time established an expert panel, an independent panel, to advise it in respect of appropriate settings for the regime in that state. And almost every recommendation made by that panel was taken up and resulted in unanimous passage, actually, by the Parliament in South Australia of that legislation. The South Australians at the time they legislated did put in place a really good statutory review process. So by the 1st of January next year, that panel in South Australia will need to be established and will work through and have a public consultation as part of really serious consideration of the impact that the laws had. And as I said before, of course, accountability depends on there being transparency about what the consequences have been. So that's the process side of things. And though the South Australian experience really contrasts with what happened federally, because unfortunately, when the federal reforms were passed at the start of 2025, there had been no meaningful public consultation process. There was no parliamentary scrutiny. In fact, debate on the bill was guillotined, which is really concerning when we're talking about legislation that affects people's fundamental democratic rights, and there isn't a proper statutory review process in that legislation. It's another serious concern amongst the many with that particular law as passed. Now, for fairness from a substance perspective, then, you're trying to balance, and I like what Zim said before about the values that we're really trying to give expression to in this legislation. We know that there is a real and perceived risk of undue influence, and we need to try to address that. Donation caps and expenditure caps are one way of doing that. Equally, we know that they can have a harmful impact upon fairness and ability to compete. So we need to try to achieve both of those things to the maximum possible extent. And so what we're looking for then, when we look at a piece of legislation in this space, assessing it for whether it is going to be create fairness to the maximum extent possible or not, is, well, if there are donations caps, what level are they set at? And if there are public funding arrangements, what do they look like? Do they really, really, really end up heavily favouring incumbents? Is there policy funding in place for new entrants to support their work so that our political contest can be a contest of ideas, which is really what we want to be able to incentivise in the use of public money? If we have administrative funding in place, is it decreasing at a marginal rate, as we would expect to see it do? And in fact, it was a good thing that the Victorian administrative funding did, aside from the problems with it. If we have expenditure caps in place, are they proportionately higher for new entrants? Because we know that they need to be. If we look at the New South Wales scheme, which out of all the schemes in place around the country, has probably tried most perhaps to grapple with this fairness problem, it does allow a proportionately higher spend for independents, because they don't have the benefits of the major party machine and major party advertising, general party advertising, to benefit them. So we're looking for all those sorts of things when we're assessing fairness of regimes. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Catherine. Another question from Peter in the chat is, how does external influence campaigning through social media by nation states, organisations or individuals, and enabled by technologies such as AI, get factored into campaign expenses for candidates? So I think that's a question about third-party campaigning, particularly from nation states, organisations or individuals. Is that something, maybe, Zim, a question for you?
Sure. To the best of my understanding, the answer should be very little influence, because foreign donations are banned. So that should not be a mechanism. What happens in practice is, of course, maybe a slightly different question. Just as a point of comparison, the United Kingdom Parliament has just passed laws banning political donations via cryptocurrency and all foreign donations. They used to allow foreign donations. And this is, I think, a really interesting development happening in the UK, which I think speaks to the way in which politics is changing around the world, both in terms of the technologies associated with political financing and political campaigning, but also, I spoke a little bit about the sorts of values that we might want to achieve through political financing. The other side of that is the sorts of pathologies we wish to avoid. And the reality is that we live in a time where there are really strong kind of populist instincts that pose challenges for people who believe in, if you like, the institutions of liberal democracy, the processes of liberal democracy, and thinking about political finance as a way of addressing pathology, as well as achieving values, is, I think, a very useful prism as well.
Tim, I've got a couple more audience questions that I do want to come back to, but I just want to first check on the results of our last audience question. We asked what one word describes what you want to see in the new donation legislation, and here are your answers. Most common word, fairness, and fair is also there, transparency, and other responses coming in: real-time disclosure, equitable, visionary, robust, legitimacy, equality, no major loopholes. But fairness and transparency definitely standing out there as the major responses. But based on that, Justice Redlick, I'm wondering, one of the debates that we're currently having on how laws should be designed and considered by the Victorian Parliament this week when it sits is around transparency of donations and return of a disclosure regime. Part of the debate is also about retrospectivity of any laws that are considered and passed by the Victorian Parliament this week. I'm just interested in what your views are about the capacity to make laws retrospective and to have visibility and transparency around any donations that have been made in this period where there has been a regulatory vacuum.
Well, I think it's useful to start with recognising the real limitation which flows from the High Court's decision. The High Court, unfortunately, reached the conclusion, if we're looking for a fair system which involves transparency, the High Court reached the conclusion that it was only because one of the forms of nominated entities in the old legislation had a cut-off date beyond which that form of entity could not operate, and the High Court said that that was invalid as contrary to the implied freedom of expression on political matters. But it's very clear that they did not conclude that legislation which continues to utilise the concept of the nominated entities would fall foul of the Constitution and the implied freedom of expression on political matters. Why do I say that? Because it means that if we're going to have a debate about future legislation and its consequences, we have to realise that the likelihood is high that the Parliament of today will continue to pass legislation which contains the concept of nominated entities, which in turn, of course, means that the registered political parties will continue to have access to substantial funding which is not available to other candidates. And so I assume that the majority of Victorians will say that that hardly equates with a fair system, giving candidates an equal opportunity in terms of their campaign, and that's something we have to face. The harsh reality is, I expect when the government introduces the legislation, it will continue to contain the nominated entity provisions. The government has said that it's going to backdate that legislation to the date that the High Court announced the legislation to be invalid. The law over a long period of time has viewed, or rather set its face against retrospectivity, backdating legislation. Certainly, it's highly objectionable that legislation is passed which says that something that was done in the past at a time when it was lawful will now be treated as something that is unlawful, constituting an offence. Now, I don't know whether the government intends to go that far, but the notion of saying something is illegal that wasn't illegal at the time that it was engaged in is something that would be offensive to most reasonable persons. We do have some forms of retrospectivity in Australia. Sometimes governments announce that a tax reform is going to be introduced, and that it will be introduced from the date that the government announces that it's going to introduce that reform, rather than the date that the legislation is enacted. if that were an argument which the government wants to rely upon, I would expect that any announcement as to what the future legislation will entail would require sufficient specificity so that everybody understands exactly what that legislation is going to be. At present, we have no idea what sort of a cap the government has in mind that it will seek to introduce in new legislation. If and when it does tell the community what that cap might be, there may be an argument for backdating the requirement of the cap, but it's very difficult to imagine a justifiable basis for saying that money that has been spent on a campaign, whilst it was not illegal to utilise such funds, should be refunded in some way to those who provided the campaign funds in the first place. I think that of all of the matters that might be backdated and which would have any justification is the notion of transparency. But whatever else might be said, the community is entitled to know what funds have been provided to candidates, regardless of what the law says in the future about capping and campaign funding, that the law should provide, and it hopefully will, that the candidates need to be transparent about whatever funding they've received. So I hope I haven't confused things by talking about the difficulties in the High Court judgment, because it's not an easy judgment to read. But I think it's imperative that the perception which I think exists that nominated entities got squashed by the High Court's reasoning is simply wrong. On the contrary, the government will have every reason to think that it can safely, at least so far as a constitutional challenge is concerned, safely enact further legislation containing the concept of nominated entities, which will continue to enable the registered political parties to have resources available to them that are not available to the ordinary candidate. And that, of course, is truly a real source of unfairness.
Well, thank you for that answer, and thank you to all of our panelists for what has been an excellent discussion. So on behalf of everyone here today, I want to thank our panel, Robert, Catherine, Zim and Zoe, for your expertise and insights and your time today. As I mentioned at the start of this discussion, the independent candidate for Hawthorn, Shima Ibuki, accepted our invitation to participate in this discussion today. I'd like to invite Ms. Ibuki to speak to us for a few moments and to share her response to this discussion today.
Thanks very much, Tom, for the opportunity to say a few words in place of the political panel that we cancelled. I think what this afternoon's discussion has really emphasised is just how structurally unequal the Victorian electoral funding system is for new community independents like me. And from speaking to people about this over the weekend, I've found the biggest misconceptions in politics is that if someone decides to stand as an independent candidate, they simply enter the race on a reasonable equal footing with everyone else. So as Zoe described, as a first-time community independent candidate, I start with absolutely zero campaign infrastructure and zero accumulated campaign funding. I don't have a party machine behind me. I don't have decades of donor networks. I don't have paid campaign staff already in place. And I don't have access to public funding generated from previous election results or nominated entities that can funnel unlimited amounts to my campaign under a grandfathered scheme only available to the Liberal, Labor and National parties. You might have read that I did receive a $40,000 crowdfunded donation from Climate 200, and I'm very grateful to receive that because until now, virtually all the work to establish my campaign has relied on goodwill and volunteer labour. People have been donating their evenings, weekends, professional expertise and personal energy simply because they care about their community and want genuine representation. But as we know, goodwill is not a sustainable model for democracy, and democracy should not depend on whether people are prepared to work themselves into exhaustion just to give their community another electoral choice. In practical terms, my Liberal opponent is expected to have access to at least around $793,000 in campaign resources, and likely more, also because major parties can strategically redirect funding from safe seats and unwinnable seats into electorates they want to retain. And I think that's the key point here. This debate is not really about whether independents should receive donations. Of course they need to. The real question is whether Victoria wants a democratic system that genuinely allows new voices and community candidates to compete fairly, or whether we entrench a system where only the major parties can realistically afford to participate at scale. Democracy works best when communities can choose from a genuinely open field of candidates, not just those backed by existing political machines. Before I finish, I really want to thank everyone who's participated in this afternoon's town hall, organisers, panel members, and the many community members who have come along and engaged with these issues. I'm really encouraged by town halls and conversations like this, because there needs to be more attention given to the rules around political funding, ultimately to shape who can participate in our democracy, whose voices are heard, and who's able to put themselves forward for public office. So, you know, if we want a healthy democracy, then these issues simply can't be left to political insiders. We need public scrutiny, informed debate, and continued pressure for reform. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to say a few words, and grateful to everyone here this afternoon for contributing towards that discussion. And I hope that we can continue to pursue these matters in a constructive and bipartisan way, because fairness, transparency, and public trust in our democratic system should matter to us all, regardless of political persuasion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Vicky. I'd now like to invite Dr. Tim Reid, the member for Brunswick, who's joining us today to represent the Victorian Greens, to share his response to this discussion today.
Thank you very much, and I've learned a lot listening to all the various comments. I'm very grateful to the people who've spoken and to the organisers for that. I feel terrible because I don't want to spoil a good time, but I feel like that I want to inject a little bit note of realism into the political moment that we're in. Right now, the government has been forced. The government hasn't created this moment. They've been forced to this moment, and they want to fix it up as fast as they can. And so they want to get something together that enough people will be happy with to get through their own caucus, which is probably, we shouldn't underestimate that challenge, and the upper house. And so I think that there may be less opportunity to influence the outcome or to bring new ideas into the outcome than we would like. But that shouldn't stop us campaigning for or raising those things. I just kind of feel obliged to point out that on past performance, we wouldn't expect the government to create a Rolls-Royce electoral funding regime this week or next. So I also want to just basically say that I've agreed with most of the ideas and the concepts expressed, that I think that campaign expenditure caps, spending caps would help solve a lot of the problems. A lot of regimes have them, and we've been pushing for that in the discussions we've been part of. But I also don't think we've got much chance at this stage of getting that up. And I think that overall, money is corrosive to democracy, and you might not all agree with that, but I think that the more money that we bring in, the worse it gets, because there are large, very large sections of the population who are disenfranchised as soon as you give power to money. And so I think that's an important principle to recognise. But I also understand and completely appreciate the problems with the barriers to new entrants. And I'm not optimistic that that's something that will be solved very well, but in the current discussions. And I'll just finish off by saying that it shouldn't cost a lot in an ideal world to campaign for a seat or for election. That the more money you spend on a campaign, the more you get repetition and slogans and seeing the same message on every street corner and in 3-metre high letters. But the actual amount of information, the amount of policy, the new concepts introduced, they don't improve with more money. It's about 20 grand to put a postcard into every letterbox in a lower house seat or a leaflet. And once you start spending more money than that, you're just basically making Mark Zuckerberg richer. So I think I want to just give people some of those ideas, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Reid. And I think it's been a useful discussion today, talking about the balance between caps, donation caps and expenditure caps, taking money out of politics, and the need for fairness in the fundamental design of our electoral finance laws, and getting that balance right. Hopefully many of you would have seen that last week Democracy Counts published a joint advertisement in the Age newspaper on Friday, stating that Victorians have a right to know who is funding their political candidates. 9 organisations, including the Centre for Public Integrity and the Accountability Roundtable, called on all parliamentarians to do 3 things. 1, to restore transparency and disclosure immediately to protect the integrity of the November 2026 state election. 2, to ensure a fair playing field. Reforms to donation laws must not favour major parties, and wealthy donors must not have more influence over politics than ordinary people. And 3, it called for real reform, and we're calling for the Victorian Parliament to legislate a robust, expert-led, transparent, inclusive and independent process with public consultation to take place immediately following the election to deliver reform that lasts. We're keen today for attendees on today's town hall to endorse this call. We're asking that you show your endorsement by choosing yes on your device now. We'll be sharing with representatives across the political spectrum that this call is supported by everyday Victorians, not just by experts and advocates. The more people who can show they care about this important issue, the more pressure we can bring to achieve on a fair and transparent system. So if anyone wants to endorse that, invite you to scan the QR code on your screen now and endorse our open letter. Before we wrap up this town hall, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the Democracy Counts campaign. Democracy Counts is a campaign powered by McKinnon, an independent bipartisan organisation. The campaign is building an alliance of which the Centre for Public Integrity, the Accountability Roundtable are a part, and together we're campaigning to protect and renew Australia's democracy. The reality we face today is sobering. Research we conducted has recently been published and shows that while Australians overwhelmingly value our democracy, they're losing confidence in how it's being run. They feel the system is working for the few, not the many. And they see a flood of disinformation, a lack of transparency and lobbying, and they feel their voices are being drowned out by short-term political interests. We need a deep cultural shift to renew the trust Australians have in our democracy and our democratic institutions. And Democracy Counts is about building that change. We're seeking to build a long-term platform to organise that quiet, widespread desire for a better democracy into a powerful, non-partisan movement for reform. We're not here to tweak around the edges. We want to see that every Australian feels that their voice truly counts. That's the heart of Democracy Counts. And I hope each and every one of you will be part of the movement into the future. To make that possible, I'm asking you today to say, count me in. Please go to our website, which is www.democracycounts.org.au, and fill in the Count Me In form. By doing so, you aren't just joining a mailing list, you're joining a disciplined, coordinated movement that will drive pressure needed for real policy change. I've always believed that when Australians come together with a shared purpose, there's nothing we can't achieve. This isn't about one side of politics or the other. This is about the rules of the game and the information environment that allow us all to thrive as a nation. So that brings us to the end of this town hall. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to our panel, Robert, Catherine, Zim and Zoe. And thanks also to Shimmer and to Tim for being here to respond today. So thank you and have a good evening.